You are a royal doctor in the Madrid palace and the year is 1834. The king has passed away, but your duties remain unfinished. You have been called to the private chambers of the late Frederick II for a task so strange and unprecedented that you begin to doubt your own reason. The Queen Regent Mary Christina stands before you, tears filling her eyes, delivering a request that sends chills through your entire being. Your hands shake as you draw near the bed where Frederick's body rests. Even in death, the man who ruled Spain with terror for more than 20 years seems to sneer at you from beyond the grave. Yet it is not his face that grabs your attention. It is what lies hidden beneath the silk sheets. The very thing that marked his reign as forcefully as his cruelty, his distrust, and his betrayals. The anatomical anomaly that historians would whisper about for generations but never dare include in official accounts. Frederick VII's grotesquely large and oddly shaped endowment was both his deepest shame and his most twisted source of pride. As you begin the process of preservation, your thoughts drift to the rumors circulating through the palace halls. Tales of special cushions, wives who screamed, and desperate efforts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel design. You come to understand you are not merely conserving flesh and bone, but protecting the physical symbol of a reign that was itself misshapen, excessive, and ultimately ruinous to all it touched. Before diving into these long-forgotten tales of endurance and hardship, if you love uncovering hidden chapters of history, think about pressing the like button and subscribing for more content like this. Also, please share in the comments where you are tuning in from. It amazes me that we are discovering these ancient narratives together from various corners of the globe, united across both time and distance by our mutual fascination with the past. To truly grasp Frederick VII, you must recognize that he was born under a curse, not caused by magic or divine punishment, but by the dangerous inheritance of many generations of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent countless years marrying close relatives, such as cousins or uncles to nieces, resulting in a genetic nightmare that showed itself through mental disorders and physical abnormalities. Frederick came forth from this toxic lineage as a living symbol of royal decay. Born at El Escorial Palace on the 14th of October in the year 1784, he was the child of Charles IV and Mary Louise of Palmer, a union arranged between first cousins. The genetic cards were stacked against him from the very beginning, and Frederick would endure the consequences in the most personal and humiliating ways imaginable. As he matured from a child into an adolescent, it became painfully clear that nature had played a particularly harsh trick on Spain's future monarch. His physical development defied medical knowledge of the time. By the years of his youth, the royal doctors had already become alarmed by the unusual way his body was changing. Whispers around the royal anomaly spoke of an incredibly large and oddly shaped member that appeared almost otherworldly in its size. Historical medical documents long concealed in the Vatican archives describe Frederick's condition with clinical precision while revealing the disturbing nature of his situation. One doctor reported, "His Royal Highness has an organ of such remarkable size and unusual shape that intimate encounters might be quite difficult." Another was even more straightforward. "The prince's organ resembles nothing but a billiard cue, thin as candle wax near its base, yet as thick as a man's fist at the end, long enough to serve as a walking stick." The emotional toll on young Frederick was immense. In a time when male beauty followed classical Greek ideals, and smaller was seen as more sophisticated and noble, Frederick's enormous member marked him as an outcast. What might be admired by modern standards instead became an overwhelming source of disgrace for the future monarch of Spain. Frederick's early years were a vivid example of dysfunction that would have shattered most, but instead shaped him into a ruthless leader. His father, Charles IV, was feeble-willed and more interested in hunting than governing. His mother, Mary Louise, was a woman with insatiable desires who openly displayed her affair with Michael Godfrey, the real power behind the throne in Spain. Young Frederick witnessed these daily humiliations, absorbing bitter lessons about power, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. Yet none of this compared to the profound impact of his physical condition on his psyche and identity. An unusual condition profoundly influenced his personality. The court murmured frequently about the young prince's state. Servants whispered and covered their faces with their hands as they laughed. Courtiers tossed subtle jests, while international envoys reported back to their superiors concerning the Spanish embarrassment. Frederick understood early on that he was a subject of ridicule, that his private self was a source of entertainment for others. This public humiliation fostered a deep and simmering bitterness within him, which later affected his approach to Spain as a whole. Frederick began interpreting mockery in every respectful gesture from his people, in the formal greetings of his educators, and even in the rehearsed smiles of proposed brides. His suspicions were not entirely without merit, as there truly were those laughing at him, though not always for the reasons he believed. As he matured, his tutors observed troubling shifts in his demeanor. He became more guarded, vindictive, and harsh toward those around him. Employees who displeased him faced dismissal or worse consequences. Frederick was beginning to wield the authority of his role as a means to offset the helplessness he felt due to his physical condition. One episode noted in the writings of a court chaplain sheds light on the growing darkness in Frederick's character. When a young servant inadvertently entered the prince's chamber while he was changing, Frederick did not simply ignore the breach. Instead, he punished the boy with a harsh beating and arranged for his entire family to be banished from Madrid. The warning was unmistakable. No one was allowed to witness the prince's disgrace. As Frederick reached an age suitable for marriage, the full scope of his anatomical difficulty became apparent to the royal medical team. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal physician, left behind confidential notes that reveal a troubling insight into Frederick's physical condition. His Majesty's member, Flores described, displays a most unusual shape. The base measures no wider than a man's thumb, yet it expands to an extraordinary circumference well beyond natural norms. The length surpasses any documented human example, approaching 10 inches in its natural state and increasing significantly when stimulated. Most alarming was the abnormal bend and the presence of what seemed to be additional tissue growths without any clear biological purpose. The consequences for Frederick's role as a spouse and father were immediately clear. Normal physical intimacy would be unattainable without considerable medical assistance and custom-made devices. The royal artisans were secretly tasked with producing what they delicately termed marital aids. These specially crafted cushions and supports were designed to enable Frederick to engage sexually without inflicting serious harm on his future partners. Yet the physical difficulties represented only part of the problem. Frederick's condition also triggered psychological effects that extended far beyond intimacy. He became fixated on potions and elixirs that promised relief from his challenges, but brought other complications. Frederick was promised either to correct his physical condition or to boost his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign doctors were quietly summoned to Madrid, each offering miraculous cures that perpetually proved ineffective. The prince squandered vast sums on these fraudulent treatments. He ingested blends containing powdered rhinoceros horn, crushed pearls, and rare herbs, all claimed to regulate his royal vitality. Some elixirs aimed to reduce the size of his member to ordinary measurements, while others professed to improve his vigor despite its unusual form. None of these attempts worked. Yet Frederick's despair rendered him vulnerable to fraudsters and swindlers. In the year 1802, Frederick married his first cousin, Princess Mary Christina of Naples and Sicily. Their marriage had been arranged during their teenage years, and Mary Christina arrived in Madrid full of romantic expectations regarding her future spouse. She had heard that some admirers referred to him as the beloved one, and fancied herself wed to a prince from a fairy tale. The wedding was splendid, reflecting the union of two royal dynasties. The cathedral resonated with music, the streets of Madrid thronged with festivities, and the young couple appeared to embody the ideal royal pair. Mary Christina was not only beautiful but also intelligent and sincerely hopeful about her future. Frederick, on his side, seemed almost normal in public, charming, considerate, and suitably romantic. However, while royal weddings conclude, the wedding night begins, and the first issue emerged when Frederick's valet came to speak with Mary Christina. Attendants to Antonia came with an uncommon plea. Special arrangements had to be made for the royal sleeping chamber. They brought items that left the ladies puzzled, but were assured to be standard for royal spouses. Handmade cushions arrived together with bottles of oils, candles, and various tools, which seemed more medicinal than romantic. Mary Antonia, protected and naive like most noble brides of her time, had no understanding of any of this. Her schooling had been strictly religious, centered on languages, music, and courtly manners. The fundamental realities of married life were only outlined to her in the vaguest manner by anxious older women who themselves had little knowledge of the specific difficulties she was about to encounter. When Frederick entered the bridal chamber, Mary Antonia's first sight of her husband without clothes sent her into a panic. One lady-in-waiting, writing many years later, described the episode. Her Majesty started screaming as if she had seen the devil itself. She retreated against the wall, shouting and pointing, "Monster, monster!" until we feared she had completely lost her mind. Frederick's organ, as witnesses described it, looked like a large club with a slender handle, far beyond anything the sheltered princess had ever imagined. The overwhelming size frightened her deeply, but it was the strange shape, the way it bent and coiled, the bizarre lumps along its length, the almost alien look of the whole structure that truly shattered her. What followed resembled less a romantic wedding night and more a clinical intervention. Frederick's specially trained doctors had to be summoned to carefully explain to the shocked princess what her role in the process would be. Cushions designed for the occasion were set in place, oils were applied, and a method began that appeared closer to an operation than an act of love. Contemporary descriptions, concealed in private correspondence among the court physicians, reveal a scene marked by almost unbelievable dysfunction. Frederick needed a custom-made pillow to support his large member, preventing self-injury during their intimate moments. Despite these measures, the experience remained so distressing for Mary Antonia that she required medication to endure it. The mental toll on both individuals was heartbreaking. Frederick, already plagued with paranoia and insecurity about his condition, became increasingly tormented when confronted with his wife's clear revulsion. Mary Antonia, on the other hand, developed what today's psychologists would classify as intense sexual trauma. She gradually began to consume growing amounts of sedatives, eventually becoming dependent on them as a means to flee the nightmare of her marital obligations. Their efforts to fulfill their duties became a ritualized horror, repeating with tragic consistency. Frederick would call upon his medical team, who prepared the chamber complete with specialized apparatus. Mary Antonia was given enough medication to make her submissive but still conscious. The procedure would then commence. The encounters were carried out with mechanical precision, after which both individuals would withdraw to different sections of the palace to recuperate from their ordeal. As the months turned into years without any success in conceiving, Frederick's despair intensified greatly. He became firmly convinced that his wife's clear aversion was somehow preventing pregnancy, and he started trying increasingly strange techniques to overcome what he perceived as her feminine weakness. Historical court documents reveal that Frederick commissioned the creation of special restraints designed to hold Mary Antonia firmly in place during their private moments, stopping her from pulling away or showing any signs of disgust. These leather and silk devices were made by the same craftsmen responsible for the king's saddles and hunting gear, infusing a deeply unsettling atmosphere into the royal workshops. Frederick also developed an obsession with scheduling their unions according to astrological charts and phases of the moon. He sought advice from astronomers, astrologers, and even practitioners of occult arts, who promised to manipulate the stars to favor the royal conception. The palace soon became a gathering place for charlatans peddling fertility elixirs, enchanted talismans, and ceremonial rites that claimed to break the curse associated with Frederick's unusual anatomy. One particular desperate moment involved Frederick consulting a wandering mystic who asserted origins from the Orient. This alleged sage convinced the king that his unique physical traits were actually a sign of... Frederick believed he was graced with divine favor through the dragon's rod, and required only the appropriate rites to unlock its fruitful power. For 3 months, Frederick and his wife endured peculiar ceremonies that included incense, chanting, and postures supposedly derived from ancient Chinese manuscripts. Twice, by some miracle, Mary Christina became pregnant. The court celebrated with joy, Frederick's hopes surged, and Spain held its breath in anticipation of an heir to the crown. However, both pregnancies ended tragically, with miscarriages that left the royal couple deeply scarred. The first loss in the year 1804 happened in the 4th month of pregnancy. Court doctors blamed the rare strains placed on the Queen's fragile health. What they implied but never dared say was that Frederick's physical condition made their intimacy so painful that Mary Christina's body could not carry a pregnancy to full term. The second miscarriage in the following year was even more heartbreaking. Mary Christina almost reached the final stage of pregnancy before losing the baby during an extremely difficult and bloody labor that nearly cost her life. The Queen never fully healed from this trauma, and her dependency on laudanum grew so serious that she became a mere shadow of herself for the last 2 years she lived. Frederick's response to these tragedies exposed the deepest corners of his character in a way nothing else could. Selfishness and harshness prevailed. Instead of any sympathy for his wife's anguish, he became convinced that she was purposely undermining their chances of having an heir. He charged her with taking substances to avoid pregnancy, deliberately moving in ways causing miscarriages, and secretly holding liberal views that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a legitimate Catholic successor. These whispers, circulating through the palace hallways, shattered what little remained of Mary Antonia's fragile mental state. She started to believe she was truly cursed, that her body rejected Frederick's seed because of some hidden sin or divine punishment. Her final months were spent almost endlessly praying, pleading for forgiveness for sins she could not identify and crimes she never committed. When Mary Antonia passed away in May of the year 1807, at the tender age of only 21, the official reason was recorded as a fever coupled with complications from her fragile condition. The reality was far grimmer than this. She had effectively died from despair, with both her mind and body ravaged by years of sexual trauma, addiction to drugs, and mental torment. Even in death, Mary Antonia could not escape the distorted realm of Frederick's paranoia. Soon gossip spread claiming she had been poisoned not by enemies of the state, but by Frederick himself, who had grown weary of her failures as a spouse and wished to begin anew with a different wife who might succeed in bearing an heir. Speculation grew following the mysterious death of the palace apothecary, who was discovered lifeless in his quarters just a few days after Mary Antonia's demise. He had left behind an enigmatic letter that was promptly confiscated by Frederick's agents and never appeared again. Some claimed the letter contained admissions about poisons given to the Queen, while others thought it revealed the real nature of Frederick's health issues and the unbearable pressures placed on his spouse. Frederick's conduct after Mary Antonia's death spoke volumes. Although he displayed proper outward signs of mourning, privately he seemed almost relieved. Within a few weeks, he began exploring the possibility of remarriage, focusing in particular on women who had already demonstrated fertility through children from previous marriages. Meanwhile, the king's doctors worked desperately to devise new remedies for his condition. If Frederick was to wed again, they needed to find methods to make physical relations less distressing for future queens. This effort resulted in some of the most unusual medical trials in royal history, as physicians sought to invent increasingly sophisticated marital aids and develop novel surgical procedures aimed at altering Frederick's anatomy. As Frederick neared his second wedding, his personality was already revealing the dark characteristics that would later render him one of the most loathed rulers in history. The sexual trauma endured during his first marriage, combined with his deep-rooted doubts about his physical state, shaped a man who could not form true emotional bonds or show compassion. Frederick learned to view others not as unique individuals with their own emotions and needs, but as instruments for his enjoyment or barriers to be removed. His first spouse was a tool that malfunctioned and needed to be discarded. His subjects served as instruments to uphold his authority and satisfy his vanity. Anyone who challenged him was considered an obstacle demanding elimination. The prince's behavior toward palace employees revealed a rising cruelty. He began pushing his authority to extremes by giving more and more arbitrary and harsh commands. Servants who accidentally saw him unclothed were not merely sent away, but often vanished altogether. Guards who failed to keep complete silence about the royal quarters were reassigned to perilous outposts on the edges of Spain's declining empire. Frederick also grew obsessed with the idea that people constantly mocked him behind his back. This fear was not without cause, as people did indeed discuss his condition, but Frederick's reaction was excessive and increasingly brutal. He started keeping records of those he suspected of ridicule and devised intricate retaliatory plans to carry out once he had enough power. By the year 1807, Frederick had become the focal point of a complicated conspiracy involving several figures in Spain's realm. The most influential nobles and military commanders viewed the prince as their means to topple the feeble administration of Charles IV and his despised advisor Michael Godfrey. What they failed to realize was that they were aligning themselves with a man whose sexual dysfunction had triggered a personality disorder, ultimately more perilous than the ineptitude they aimed to eliminate. The plotters called themselves the Fredericists and labored endlessly to enhance Frederick's status as Lesiardo, the chosen one. They circulated tales highlighting his intellect, devotion to the nation, and potential to be a reform-minded monarch who would revive Spain's past glory. What they carefully hid was their growing recognition of Frederick's mental instability and his increasingly alarming conduct toward anyone who opposed him. The scheme reached its climax in October of the year 1807 with the event known as the Esquirol Conspiracy, where Frederick was discovered plotting to depose his own father with the assistance of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the intrigue was exposed, Frederick's reaction exposed both his timidity and utter lack of loyalty to anyone, even his fellow conspirators. Instead of supporting those who had risked everything for his cause, Frederick immediately sacrificed them all, confessing in detail every element of the plan and naming everyone involved. Every ally pleaded for mercy and asked their parents to forgive them. While his supporters were condemned to imprisonment and banishment, this act of treachery established a recurring theme that would characterize Frederick's entire reign. He consistently exploited individuals for his personal ambitions and then discarded them whenever it suited his needs. Amid the unfolding political intrigues of Frederick, his health deteriorated progressively. The royal doctors observed that his member was continuously enlarging and altering its shape, developing unusual deformities that complicated intimate encounters further. Some medical scholars propose that Frederick might have been afflicted by a rare disorder known as megaloi, a hormonal imbalance resulting in continual growth of male genitalia throughout adulthood. Regardless of the medical cause, the practical consequences were obvious. Frederick would require increasingly advanced aids and ever more submissive wives if he hoped to father an heir. This fact prompted one of the most disturbing elements of his later marriages: the intentional choice of women who could be mentally dominated or physically forced into complying with his conditions. Meanwhile, the palace artisans had become experts in designing progressively intricate marital apparatus. Their workshops, concealed deep within the royal palace, resembled a strange mixture of a medical facility and a torture chamber, where they crafted these devices. Adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and various tools were created to enable Frederick's intimate encounters while reducing harm to his partners. The craftsmen involved took oaths of complete secrecy, and Frederick ensured their silence through a mix of generous rewards and frightening threats. Several artisans connected to these projects were later found dead under mysterious conditions, fueling speculation that Frederick had them eliminated to avoid any risk of revealing the true nature of their work. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced Frederick to abdicate, the future king faced an especially degrading situation. He had not only lost his throne, but was also held captive by someone undoubtedly aware of his embarrassing medical condition. French intelligence maintained extensive records on the Spanish royal family, and Frederick's unique anatomical condition was surely among the data they collected. His 6-year imprisonment at the Château de Valence was marked by ongoing medical experimentation as French doctors, fascinated by his condition, conducted studies. Freed from the restrictions of royal decorum that had limited their Spanish counterparts, these physicians performed examinations and treatments so thorough they bordered on torture. The French medical documents found in Napoleonic archives centuries later offer the most comprehensive clinical account of Frederick's condition. Frederick's medical condition was unlike anything ever documented before. They described an intimate organ so enormous and deformed that it appeared more suited to a mythical creature than a human monarch. French physicians speculated that Frederick's affliction was caused by a combination of several hereditary disorders merging within one person, creating what they labeled a perfect storm of physical abnormalities. During his imprisonment, Frederick also received reports from various Spanish aristocrats and military commanders who were actively fighting to reinstate him. The situation was deeply ironic. Courageous soldiers were sacrificing their lives in muddy trenches and rugged mountain paths to bring back a king whose main focus was discovering new ways to cope with his intimate dysfunction and to father an heir to carry on his cursed lineage. Throughout his years in exile, Frederick composed lengthy letters addressed to different European sovereigns, searching for potential brides willing to accept his unique condition. These handwritten messages reveal a man utterly detached from the anguish afflicting his nation, fixated solely on his personal, intimate challenges, while Spain was engulfed in struggle. Frederick was plotting his subsequent wedding night upon Frederick's return to Spain in the year 1814. The throngs applauding his arrival were unlike anything that had ever been witnessed across Europe. People tossed flowers, wept with happiness, and dropped to their knees as his carriage rolled by. Children born amidst the conflict caught their first sight of the monarch their parents had died defending. Even the very stones of Madrid seemed to resonate with song and celebration. During the celebration, Frederick smiled and waved from his carriage, yet his thoughts were already consumed by more personal matters. His immediate concern was not ruling Spain or rewarding those loyal to his reinstatement. Instead, his focus was on finding a new wife capable of finally providing the long-awaited heir. The king's comeback also signaled the start of what scholars refer to as the troubling decade. However, the true darkness lay not only in Frederick's authoritarian rule, but in his growing desperation and strange efforts to fulfill his royal obligation to produce offspring. His sexual difficulties had become intertwined with his political failures, resulting in a monarch whose personal flaws triggered a national disaster. Frederick's initial action as the reinstated monarch was to commission a completely new set of marital aids from the finest European artisans. He dispatched agents to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire to locate craftsmen skilled in making devices suited for sensitive royal situations. The collection they assembled was stored secretly within palace chambers and represented the peak of twisted creativity the early 19th century could offer. Frederick's second choice for a spouse was Mary Isabel of Portugal, yet another cousin within the continuous circle of royal intermarriage that plagued his family line. When she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816, she was 19 years old, filled with the innocent hope typical of young princesses entering arranged marriages. The court physicians She had already informed her ladies-in-waiting about the unique arrangements needed for the wedding night, but nothing could have braced Isabel for the harsh reality awaiting her. The wedding ceremony itself was a display of extravagant Baroque opulence intended to conceal the rising desperation of a monarch whose rule was becoming associated with collapse. Frederick stood at the altar, clad in golden fabric, his expression a mask of barely suppressed nervousness. He had spent the preceding week consulting doctors, alchemists, and even a mysterious individual rumored to be an Ottoman expert in royal ailments who had come to Madrid under cover of darkness. The wedding night turned into a catastrophe that would haunt both of them throughout their brief union. Despite all the preparations, the devices, and the consultations with specialists from all over Europe, Frederick's physical impairment remained as formidable as ever. The cries resounding through the palace corridors that night were not cries of love, but of genuine fear and agony. Servants discovered blood-stained linens and shattered furnishings, proof of a union that resembled a medieval torture more than a noble marriage. Isabel never recovered from that dreadful night. Court witnesses observed that she developed a strong stammer and would shrink away whenever Frederick entered a chamber. She started suffering from what palace doctors referred to as hysterical episodes would today be understood as intense psychological trauma. Her attendants shared that she frequently awoke from nightmares in a terrified state, shouting warnings about a monstrous presence haunting her sleep. Frederick, on the other hand, saw his wife's fear as a direct affront to his royal honor. His well-known paranoia escalated dramatically, leading him to believe that Isabel was secretly aligning with foreign nations to ridicule his condition. He started having her letters monitored, her meals tested for toxins, and her rooms searched for signs of treachery. The king's sexual problems had grown into a political madness that affected every facet of his governance. The urge to father an heir turned into an obsession that overwhelmed both the royal pair and the entire Spanish court. Frederick arranged a succession of increasingly strange medical evaluations, gathering doctors, anatomists, and even circus performers who claimed expertise in rare anatomical issues. The royal bedroom was transformed into a site of sexual experiments that challenged the limits of human endurance and respect. One particularly unsettling report appears in the confidential journal of a court doctor from that time, recounting Frederick's choice to invite international specialists to watch over his procreation attempts. The king, desperate for answers, allowed German anatomists and French doctors were invited to witness Frederick's private failures, transforming his marital chamber into a disturbing medical stage. These experts meticulously recorded observations and created illustrations that were later distributed among European medical institutions, turning Frederick's sexual dysfunction into a topic of scholarly interest throughout the continent. Mary Christina, subjected to this spectacle of invasive medical scrutiny, began to show signs of a total mental breakdown. She stopped maintaining a regular diet, lost a dangerous amount of weight, and developed a vacant look that the servants found even more terrifying than her previous outbursts. The young queen had turned into a ghostly presence roaming the corridors of a palace that had become her prison. The political repercussions of Frederick's personal shortcomings soon became impossible to ignore. Spain's American territories, already in rebellion, used the king's failure to produce legitimate heirs as proof of divine disapproval of Bourbon rule. Revolutionary propaganda portrayed Frederick as a sexually powerless despot, whose bodily weaknesses symbolized his political failures. The monarch's deepest humiliation turned into a unifying cry for independence movements stretching from Mexico all the way to Argentina. Frederick reacted to these challenges with his usual paranoia and cruelty. He initiated a fresh series of purges aimed at anyone suspected of spreading gossip about his condition or supporting colonial insurrection. The Inquisition, which he controlled, became an instrument of this ruthless suppression. Upon regaining his authority, Frederick initiated investigations into allegations of sexual defamation targeting the monarchy, fostering an atmosphere of fear where even intimate talks between spouses could lead to incarceration or death. The monarch's fixation on confidentiality reached extreme levels. He commanded the creation of concealed corridors within the palace, enabling discreet movement between his rooms and Mary Christina's quarters without servants noticing. Furthermore, he installed mirrors placed at precise points designed to spot any potential spies. A network of informants was employed whose exclusive duty was to keep track of rumors concerning the royal couple's relationship. Meanwhile, Mary Christina's condition worsened due to the combined effects of her husband's physical abuse and his mental intimidation. Palace doctors observed that she experienced what they termed false pregnancies, intervals during which she showed symptoms of expecting a baby despite it being biologically impossible. These episodes appeared to grant Frederick fleeting hopes quickly dashed by reality. The Queen's false pregnancies turned into a cruel joke within a court already steeped in chaos. Servants murmured about how the king would restlessly walk outside Mary Christina's chambers during such times, alternately offering prayers and curses, as though divine forces might somehow reverse the cruel impossibility of the situation. Each time a false pregnancy concluded, despair returned anew. Frederick would fall into deep bouts of depression that would immobilize the government for weeks on end. In the year 1818, after enduring 2 long years of this dreadful marriage, Isabel finally escaped by the only route accessible to royal women at that time, which was death. She gave in to what the court doctors delicately described as nervous exhaustion. However, private correspondence from palace attendants hints that she might have subtly accelerated her own demise through acts of self-inflicted harm. Her last words, according to the priest who heard her confession, were a prayer of thanks for her imminent freedom. Frederick's response to Isabel's passing revealed just how far his mental state had declined. Instead of grieving his wife, he became convinced that she had been killed by adversaries aiming to stop him from having an heir. He demanded several autopsies carried out by different doctors, searched for signs of poisoning, and even arrested several of Isabel's attendants under suspicion of plotting against her. The king's sorrow was indistinguishable from his deepening paranoia, creating an endless cycle of anger and distrust that overwhelmed everyone nearby. The funeral of Queen Isabel turned into a grim event, shocking even those loyal to Frederick. The king insisted on repeatedly viewing her corpse throughout the preparation for burial, touching the body and muttering about the lost promise held within her womb. He also commissioned a death mask that he displayed in his private rooms, where visitors later claimed to have seen him performing strange rituals, conversations with the expressionless face of his late wife. Yet Frederick's search for an heir could not be postponed by sorrow or madness. Within a few months after Isabel's funeral, his advisors had already begun talks about a third marriage. The difficulty now lay in finding a European princess willing to become the wife of a king whose former consorts had experienced such tragic ends and whose unusual traits were becoming well known throughout Europe. Negotiations turned out to be more challenging than anticipated. Several candidates withdrew after consulting doctors who had served at the Spanish court. Others requested extraordinary conditions, including separate living quarters and their own security details. Frederick's intimate difficulties had transformed into a diplomatic obstacle threatening Spain's connections with future allies. Finally, the king's representatives discovered Mary Christina Amalia of Saxony, a princess whose family's severe financial troubles made them ready to ignore Frederick's infamous reputation. Mary Christina was 24 upon her arrival in Madrid in the year 1819, older and more sophisticated than Isabel had been, yet bearing the same fragile hope that her predecessors had brought. The third marriage ceremony was a toned-down occasion, reflecting both Frederick's growing age and the court's fatigue over royal marriage misfortunes. There were fewer international guests and less grandeur. The celebrations held a sense of emptiness, as if everyone was merely performing a ritual that had already failed on 2 previous occasions. Mary Joseph had been far better prepared for her ordeal than Isabel, having received thorough briefings from Saxon doctors who had collaborated with their Spanish colleagues. She arrived with her own set of medical instruments and remedies, accompanied by a personal physician who specialized in complicated marital issues. Her attitude toward the marriage was more analytical than passionate, treating her royal responsibilities as a medical puzzle to be solved using scientific methods. This pragmatic stance benefited her more than Isabel's romantic innocence, but still could not overcome the essential unfeasibility of Frederick's condition. The third marriage quickly fell into a routine of prearranged intimate encounters, meticulously planned and medically supervised to the point where they resembled surgical procedures, rather than true expressions of marital love. Mary Joseph meticulously recorded each session, noting times, techniques, and results, with the exactness of a research scientist. The Queen's emotional detachment appeared to frustrate Frederick even more deeply than Isabel's fear had done. He started to believe that Mary Joseph regarded him as a medical specimen rather than a partner, and his growing paranoia extended to the idea that she was secretly logging his condition for foreign intelligence agents. The king's network of spies. It was reported that the queen kept extensive communication with doctors from the Saxon court, sharing what Frederick believed were confidential details about his physical condition. Meanwhile, Spain continued to deteriorate under the burden of Frederick's poor governance. The American colonies had gained independence one after another, taking with them the riches that had supported the Spanish Empire for 300 years. The king's fixation on his sexual problems rendered him unable to tackle the political and economic challenges tearing his nation apart. Government meetings were delayed whenever Frederick experienced difficulties with his wife, and crucial decisions were postponed for weeks while the king conferred with doctors about new methods to achieve conception. At first, the Spanish people, grateful for Frederick's return, began to realize the real price of their reinstated monarch. Revolts were brewing in the cities while outlaws controlled rural areas. The king's subjects suffered from hunger as he expended vast sums on sexual aids and foreign medical experts. Spain had turned into a subject of ridicule in Europe, its downfall embodied by a ruler whose most private shortcomings had become public knowledge. In the year 1829, after a decade of sterile marriage, Mary Joseph accomplished what many believed impossible. She became pregnant. This revelation caused a sensation throughout the Spanish court and across Europe, where diplomatic reporters buzzed with conjecture. There were many theories about how Frederick finally overcame his physical challenges. Some believed it was the work of a higher power, while others gave credit to the advancements in medical science. The most skeptical, however, whispered about unfaithfulness and questions surrounding the legitimate succession. Frederick's feelings about the pregnancy were a blend of overwhelming joy and deep fear. He arranged for extra guards to watch over Mary Christina. Michael Godfrey brought in the best doctors from all over Europe and ensured that her rooms were blessed by every religious leader in Madrid. The king's desperation to protect this miraculous pregnancy bordered on insanity, as he became convinced that adversaries would try to harm his long-awaited heir by supernatural or scientific means. The pregnancy went smoothly until the 7th month, when Mary Christina began facing complications that the palace doctors could not explain. Today's medical understanding suggests she was dealing with placental abruption, a condition that could have been treated successfully with proper care. However, Frederick's interference in her treatment and his insistence on involving mystics and alchemists alongside professional physicians created confusion and prevented effective medical action. On May 18th in the year 1829, Mary Christina went into premature labor. The birth was a terrifying experience that left everyone present deeply unsettled because Frederick insisted on overseeing the delivery himself, despite lacking any medical expertise. The child, a daughter, lived only a short time after birth. Several hours before succumbing to the complications of an early birth, Mary Josepha survived the delivery, but she never regained her strength, passing away 3 weeks later from what doctors described as childbed fever, though it was more likely a mix of infection and overwhelming despair. Frederick's response to this double loss showed a total collapse of his mental state. He refused to permit either body to be buried, insisting that the royal physicians continue trying to revive both mother and child through increasingly strange methods. For nearly a full week, the palace was overwhelmed by the foul smell of decay as the monarch ignored the reality of his losses and demanded his medical team attempt impossible resurrections. When Frederick finally accepted that his wife and daughter were truly gone, he sank into a depression so deep that the courtiers feared for his very life. He stopped eating, avoided meeting with advisors, and spent hours staring at the death masks he had ordered for each of his 3 wives. The king had become a living phantom, haunting his own palace while Spain fell apart around him. Yet destiny had one more cruel twist waiting for Frederick IV. In the year 1829, at the age of 45, the king, who had spent many years unable to produce a surviving heir, suddenly faced an unforeseen 4th marriage. His advisors, desperate to secure stability for the disintegrating kingdom, had selected Mary Christina of Naples as a potential bride, but they kept this information from Frederick until after the decision was finalized. When the marriage arrangements were finalized, it was already known that Mary Christina was expecting a child by another man upon her arrival in Madrid. The fourth wedding, held in the year 1829, was nothing more than a charade that deceived no one. Mary Christina appeared obviously pregnant as she walked down the aisle carrying a baby who could not possibly be Frederick's offspring. Nevertheless, the king, driven by an urgent desire for an heir, accepted this clear deceit, believing that divine intervention had answered his prayers in an unusual way. The arrival of Isabella II in 1830 was supposed to signify the successful completion of Frederick's quest for succession, yet it introduced new sources of worry instead. The king was well aware that the child was not his by blood, but he had to uphold the semblance of legitimacy in order to protect his dynasty. His bond with Mary Christina was founded on mutual pretense. She acted as though she respected him, and he acted as though he believed the child was his. Frederick's later years were shadowed by the same sexual difficulties that had plagued his adult life, but now he bore the additional strain of preserving a fabricated lineage. Despite the growing challenges with age, he persisted in his futile attempts to share closeness with Mary Christina, hoping to father a child who would truly belong to him. These efforts, observed by the very same physicians and experts who had witnessed his earlier disappointments, became increasingly pitiful as time passed, with his advancing years making success even more elusive. Success grew increasingly doubtful. The paranoia that engulfed Frederick during his final years manifested in ways that shocked even the most jaded courtiers who had endured decades of royal madness. The monarch started conducting sudden inspections of Mary Christina's private chambers at all hours, bursting through doors with armed guards to catch her in supposed acts of betrayal. These midnight raids terrified the queen's attendants, who lived in constant fear they might suddenly confront a wild-eyed king brandishing accusations of conspiracy. Frederick's fixation on surveillance escalated to absurd extremes. He had peepholes drilled into the walls separating his rooms from Mary Christina's, and spent hours watching her through these crude spying devices like a deranged voyeur. Palace staff reported catching the king's eye pressed against these openings during the queen's most private moments, while she cared for their daughter during her prayers or as she pored over her thoughts. Aware of this relentless scrutiny, Mary Christina began moving through her chambers like a prisoner, meticulously controlling every movement and facial expression. The food-tasting rituals transformed into elaborate ceremonies born of mistrust that could delay meals for hours. Frederick demanded that every dish be tasted with tasters, forced to wait 30 minutes between sampling and serving to guarantee that any slow-acting poison would reveal itself. The king closely observed these unfortunate servants, deepening the atmosphere of dread surrounding the court. With the sharpness of a hawk eyeing its prey, he scanned their faces for any hint of unease that could suggest danger. Many tasters fainted from the relentless pressure, which only strengthened Frederick's conviction that assassination plots were underway. Mary Christina, caught in this web of distrust, began to exhibit the very psychological breakdown that had claimed Frederick's former wives. Her correspondence with her family in Naples, intercepted and examined by the king's agents, exposed a woman gradually losing her sanity. She described constantly feeling observed, startled by shadows, and unable to even trust her own servants. The queen portrayed her existence as living inside an invisible cage where every movement was scrutinized for signs of defiance. The king's intense suspicion reached beyond those nearest to him and spread through the entire royal court. He started changing his personal guards every day, convinced that any longer assignment would lead them to be corrupted by enemy spies. Government ministers were subjected to loyalty screenings that often bordered on absurdity. Frederick deliberately made conflicting remarks during private meetings just to watch if ministers would contradict him, interpreting any disagreement as proof of treasonous behavior. What was once a Spanish court renowned across Europe for its elegance and cultural sophistication turned into a strange realm of constant surveillance. Courtiers adapted by communicating in secret codes to avoid being caught speaking plainly. Maintaining eye contact with the king required adopting the cautious detachment of diplomats navigating hostile territory. Conversations were exchanged in hushed tones. Alliances were built and broken depending on perceived allegiance to rival factions, and everyone was acutely aware that a single careless remark could lead to imprisonment or exile. Frederick's connection with his infant daughter Isabella became another deep source of torment. Although fully aware that she was not his biological child, he simultaneously cherished her as his successor and resented her as a symbol of his sexual inadequacy. The king would spend endless hours gazing at the baby, searching her features for any trace of resemblance either to himself or to potential fathers. He commissioned artists to produce detailed portraits of Isabella at multiple stages of infancy, comparing these images carefully with paintings of himself and Mary Christina's former lovers. The question concerning Isabella's paternity haunted Frederick with extraordinary intensity because it epitomized the ultimate proof of his sexual failure. Here was a child destined to inherit his crown due solely to his inability to sire legitimate offspring. The irony struck him hard as he recognized that his greatest political accomplishment, securing the line of succession, was at the same time his deepest personal defeat. This contradiction consumed him like a corrosive acid, poisoning any fleeting moments of joy with his daughter. In response, Frederick began seeking guidance from genealogists and physiologists seeking scientific evidence to confirm Isabella's legitimacy, aimed to dispel the king's uncertainties. These specialists, fully aware of the risk involved in their mission, offered carefully vague assessments that could be interpreted to support whichever conclusion the king desired. Their documented reports, kept within palace archives, reveal the desperate ingenuity of scholars struggling to meet an impossible royal demand while safeguarding their own survival. The king's attempts to regulate his wife's conduct grew increasingly complex and intrusive. He appointed particular servants to oversee Mary Christina's correspondence, requiring them to report not only on the contents of her letters but also on her facial expressions as she wrote. Frederick insisted on detailed records of the Queen's daily routine, including the time devoted to prayer, the books she read, and the nobles she interacted with during public appearances. Mary Christina's efforts to preserve a semblance of a normal royal existence under such scrutiny demanded enormous psychological resilience. She mastered the art of separating her true feelings, displaying a calm exterior while privately enduring the relentless pressure of constant surveillance. Her personal diary, discovered centuries later concealed behind a false wall in her chambers, exposes the heavy impact this constant monitoring had on her mental well-being. She wrote about feeling like an actress who must remain in character without faltering even in her dreams. The global ramifications of this situation added another layer of complexity to an already fraught environment. Frederick's growing paranoia started to impact Spain's diplomatic ties abroad. Foreign envoys kept reporting their monarch's unpredictable conduct and the chaos within his court back to their own governments. Negotiations over royal marriages meant to strengthen European alliances came to a halt as potential partners doubted whether Spain could uphold long-lasting agreements under such erratic leadership. Frederick's personal instability had become a concern on the international stage. His fixation with uncovering assassination plots made him perceive conspiracies even in the most harmless situations. When Mary Christina asked for approval to renovate her chambers, Frederick saw it as a plan to create secret spots for weapons or poison. Whenever courtiers praised the Queen's looks, the king questioned if they were secretly sending traitorous signals. Religious ceremonies were no exception to his suspicion. Frederick doubted if Mary Christina's increased devotion was sincere worship or covert messages to foreign Catholic powers. The financial burden of Frederick's distrust was enormous. The royal treasury drained swiftly, as huge funds were spent on security, espionage, and loyalty checks, while the populace endured hardship. Frederick also ordered hidden passageways built throughout the palace, installed complex alarm systems, and maintained constant vigilance. Several groups of food samplers, guards, and attendants were employed to guarantee that no single faction could collaborate against him. Such expenditures depleted resources that might have otherwise been allocated to confront Spain's growing financial difficulties. Frederick's health started declining due to the relentless pressure of upholding his surveillance regime. Palace doctors observed that the monarch suffered from persistent sleeplessness, digestive ailments, and what they described as nervous unrest. His paranoia formed a vicious cycle where his fears incited actions that reinforced further fears, trapping him in a continuously intensifying loop of mistrust and anxiety. The deteriorating mental condition also damaged the king's relations with his remaining family members. He grew suspicious even of his closest kin, perceiving ordinary family moments as potential threats. Birthday festivities turned into stressful events where Frederick searched for signs of betrayal, whether in the way flowers were arranged or the choice of presents. Even his brother Don Carlos, who had stood by him during earlier crises, became subject to scrutiny and surveillance. Mary Christina's attempts to protect their daughter from Frederick's paranoia only fueled more conflict. The king saw the queen's maternal care as proof she was grooming Isabella to rule under foreign influence, which deepened his distrust within the family. Mary Christina asked for private time alone with her daughter. Frederick grew anxious, imagining what rebellious notions she might be planting in the young girl's mind. What should have been a simple moment of motherly affection instead became another battlefield in the king's fabricated war against conspiracy. The attendants who served closest to the royal family found themselves trapped in impossible dilemmas. They were expected to deliver detailed accounts of the queen's actions while maintaining the facade of unwavering loyalty. Under this immense strain, many developed psychological ailments, causing frequent staff changes that only intensified the court's instability. New servants, lacking familiarity with the intricate alliances and expectations, often sparked Frederick's doubts by innocent errors. Frederick's efforts to uncover the true identity of Isabella's father grew more frantic and intrusive. He commissioned investigators to compile extensive files on every man who had been close to Mary Christina during her time in Naples, searching for physical traits that could resemble his daughter's. These inquiries also delved deep into the medical backgrounds of possible fathers, their genealogies, and even personal letters from years before Isabella was born. The king's private chamber transformed into a gallery of his sexual defeats, adorned with portraits of his deceased wives and medical instruments linked to his failures. He was unable to resolve his physical ailments and turned to religious artifacts, hoping they might offer some divine remedy for his condition. Visitors to these secluded rooms described a heavy sense of sorrow that seemed to saturate the air like a lingering fragrance. Frederick would hold meetings in this very space, surrounded by constant reminders of his most personal defeats while discussing official matters. The strain on Mary Christina grew stronger as Frederick's conduct became increasingly unpredictable. The queen began to show visible signs of anxiety, such as hair loss, changes in weight, and tremors she tried hard to conceal during public events. Her attendants observed that she had developed habits driven by nervousness, frequently glancing over her shoulder and reacting with fear to unexpected noises. Frederick's distrust reached its strangest peak in the year 1832, when he firmly believed that Mary Christina was trying to poison him through close contact. The king insisted that his wife undergo medical inspections prior to any physical interaction, searching for signs of poison that could be transmitted through touch. These examinations, carried out by court doctors in Frederick's presence, marked the final humiliation of what was left of their marriage. The global audience watched Spain's spiral into madness with a mix of intrigue and horror. Diplomatic circles were equally captivated and disturbed by the unfolding tragedy. Letters from this era show that European nations were proactively preparing for the inevitable downfall of Frederick's administration. Acknowledging that the king's personal instability made effective governance unattainable, some countries began covertly supporting separatist movements within Spain, reasoning that breaking the Spanish Empire apart was better than maintaining control under an unpredictable ruler. As the year 1833 began, Frederick's physical condition started to reflect the mental damage caused by his paranoid leadership. The royal doctors observed that the king had developed a continuous tremor, ongoing digestive issues, and what seemed like early symptoms of mental deterioration. His public addresses became disjointed, filled with accusations against unknown foes and mentions of conspiracies that only existed in his mind. When the end finally arrived, it was almost unexpectedly quiet. After many years of turmoil, Frederick slowly faded away, his body finally giving in to the cumulative pressure of a lifetime fighting both his body and mind. In his final moments, he slipped between wakefulness and delirium, sometimes crying out for his deceased wives and at other times commanding inquiries into non-existent conspiracies. In 1833, Frederick II found the rest he had never attained during his lifetime, a peace granted simply by death itself. The official verdict named gout as the cause, but the palace physicians. It was privately admitted that the monarch had effectively succumbed to exhaustion of a physical, psychological, and spiritual nature brought on by several decades of sexual frustration and political suspicion. The autopsy of Frederick II, carried out in secrecy by the very doctors who had spent years attempting to understand his anatomical mysteries, revealed the true extent of nature's cruel irony. The king's organ, preserved for medical examination, measured an incredible 14 inches in length and showed significant variation in thickness from the base to the tip, precisely as contemporary accounts had described. More unsettling was the finding of internal scarring and deformities that rendered normal sexual function virtually impossible, clarifying decades of failure and distress. The examination also uncovered something else. There were signs of self-inflicted harm dating back to Frederick's teenage years. Apparently, the monarch had spent many years attempting different forms of self-surgery in an effort to alter his body to allow normal intimacy. These desperate and secretive attempts at self-repair, carried out with whatever instruments he could find, only worsened his condition and added layers of psychological anguish to his physical irregularities. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical illustrations and written notes, was sealed within the Vatican archives, where it remains today. Officials of the Church considered the material too disturbing and politically sensitive for public release. Unveiling one of history's strangest state secrets, historians granted access to these documents describe them as both captivating and deeply disturbing. This glimpse reveals the private torment behind absolute authority, twisted by biological destiny. Frederick's death marked the close of an era, yet his influence persisted in the divided Spain he left behind. Mary Christina, the daughter who might or might not have been his biological offspring, inherited a kingdom shattered by civil strife, economic devastation, and global disgrace. The Spanish Empire, once a dominant global power, was diminished to a minor player in Europe. Its downfall was hastened by years of poor governance under a monarch whose personal fixations overshadowed his responsibilities. The tale of Frederick II reminds us that power without insight is perilous, but when combined with inner turmoil, it becomes disastrous. His rule exemplified how an individual's psychological wounds can spread into collective suffering, how personal shame transforms into national tragedy, and how the most private human failings resonate through time with consequences far broader than their origin. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, Frederick's life exposes the human tragedy inherent in absolute rule, where one man's private issues dictated the fate of millions. His 3 deceased wives, his dubious daughter, his oppressed people, and his devastated kingdom all bore the burden of a hereditary curse. A misfortune that unfolded long before any of them came into the world. Frederick was both the cause and the casualty of a system that placed excessive authority in the hands of people ill-equipped to manage it. When that royal doctor in the year 1834 completed his somber duty of preserving Frederick's physical remains, he must have pondered the cruel paradox of his role. Here lay tangible proof of a reign that devoured everything it encountered: spouses, offspring, subjects, and ultimately the monarch himself. The preserved organ was not merely a medical oddity, but stood as a symbol of the devastating consequences of shame, the decay wrought by unrestrained power, and the heartbreaking loss of human promise. In the final count, Frederick III gained a form of lasting legacy, yet not the one he desired. His name endured not as a celebrated sovereign or effective leader, but as a warning about the perils inherent in disguising personal failings as political authority. His anatomical remains, concealed within the Vatican's hidden chambers, remain a testament to certain truths that are too unsettling for history to confront, too intimately human for myth to accept, and too sorrowful for time to mend. The silk linens that once covered his misshapen body now cloaked a kingdom similarly broken and incapable of operating as nature intended. Frederick II ultimately found repose, but he left behind a Spain destined to endure hardship. For many generations, people struggled to heal from the deep wounds caused by the personal calamities of his chaotic rule. The most corrupt monarch in history concluded his life exactly as he had spent it, as a cause of pain for all who were unfortunate enough to fall under his authority.